The New York City Board of Estimate was a powerful governmental body responsible for many areas of municipal policy. And on June 3rd, 1943, by a vote of 11 to 5, this board approved a contract for construction of a neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan that we now know as Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village. On that fateful day, MetLife, a huge insurance company, secured the government approvals needed to proceed with construction. But to do so, they demolished hundreds of tenements in what was known as the Gas House District. Residents were notified that they were to vacate their homes and make way for this new development. And on May 5th, 1946, Mr. and Mrs. Harry Delman and their 10-year-old son Gerard moved out of their home at 441 East 15th Street, and that address disappeared off the city grid forever. What ensued was, according to the New York Times, the greatest and most significant mass movement of families in New York's history. This new public-private partnership and the contract entered between New York City and MetLife was at the time a source of immense disruption and controversy. But this community eventually found some peace, and when all was said and done, there were over 80 buildings, 9,000 apartments, and a community of thousands. But in October of 2006, 60 years since inception, MetLife agreed to sell the complex to Tishman Speyer Properties in BlackRock for over $5 billion. This is where the story gets even more interesting, because it became a David versus Goliath story. It covers how the underdog fought to save thousands of middle-class homes through a decade of political, legal, and real estate turmoil. This riveting story is described in a wonderful book called Saving Stuyvesant Town: How One Community Defeated the Worst Real Estate Deal in History, written by the leader of this movement, New York City councilman and attorney named Dan Garodnick. A compelling and powerful read, this book tells the tale of how 30,000 Stuyvesant Town tenants fought back against corporate greed and excess. Welcome to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation. I am honored to have the leader of this cause and the author of this great book named Dan Garodnick. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
When I read the book, it was a little bit of Apollo 13 to me. When I watched Apollo 13, I kind of knew the story, but I was riveted by the tale of all the things I didn't know. When you wrote the book, did you have that in mind, that people knew the conclusion, but there was something more that needed to come to light?
Definitely. And as somebody who lived in that community for most of my life,
Right.
I knew that there were things that even I had not appreciated or known about the neighborhood, even as a kid growing up there in the 1970s, which, if you put it in the context of a community which was, first inhabited in 1949, was not that far off from its origins. And so I thought that there were a lot of details there, and it has a real significance for the history of New York City and the history of housing in New York City and the tenant movement in New York City, that I thought that this was a story worth fleshing out. And so I'm glad to hear that it was an Apollo 13 moment for you, because that's really what I wanted. And I'm glad that there were some details in there that that came to life.
Well, indeed there was. And I think what you stated early on in the book, that this is a personal narrative. This is your story. It became personal. Before we even get into the book and the story of what I'd like to be your transformation, take us back to what was it like growing up? I've passed it. I'm a New Yorker. I've passed by it, but I never knew what it was like to be in the walls or in that community. What was it like as a kid?
Well, it's so interesting because most New Yorkers who don't have any connection to the place see a wall of red brick buildings, and it looks very uninviting, unwelcoming to an outsider.
Right.
But what's interesting about the pictures that you have chosen that are behind you is that that's the experience of what I know Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village to be, which is a place with lots of grass and trees, safety, It's a place with its own private security force.
Right.
It's got as many playgrounds as you can possibly imagine as a kid. And, it was the sort of environment in which neighbors knew each other. They looked out for each other. It has that feeling of suburban living. When everybody talks, I don't know suburban living. I've never experienced suburban.
Right. What do you know?
What do I
You're
know
a New
about it?
Yorker.
But it's what everybody describes about suburban living.
Right.
And we had a vertical community, like in my own building growing up. I was babysat for and babysat, people in the building. My Spanish tutor was a guy who was a retired police officer who lived down the hall. Our next door neighbor, 2 doors over, was a furrier who taught me how to play blackjack over Tetley tea using the pennies from his coin jar. So, it was that sort of a neighborhood, which to me was, it was very warm, it was very welcoming, and it had a very strong sense of community. And I think that was one of the prime points that differentiated Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village from other places in New York City.
Well, when we talk to people outside of New York City, they often wonder, did you know the butcher, the baker, the this, the that? Did you have that experience in Stuyvesant Town? Because what you're
Certainly,
describing, yeah.
with the neighbors, really had that feeling. You got to know your neighbors, you got to know your community. My mother would lean out the window from the 13th floor of our building down to call me for dinner at the basketball court down below. So she would say, Dan, come up here. Right? So that you don't picture that for Manhattan living or New York City living for the most part. But that was the way it was. And so, yeah, it had that small town feel. You had lots of local shops and businesses that knew their locals and local residents. It had a very very comfortable and very familiar feeling to it.
For our listeners, if you have not tuned into our YouTube channel, what Dan is describing is I've created a backdrop for our video for our viewers that I took a lot of time to figure out how do I best bring the picture. And the reason I'm saying that I wanted to bring the right picture to life is I lived in the city for so many years in the East Village, but on the fringe of this community. I've never, and by my own admission, never stepped inside that community. I didn't know anybody, but it was a place that was outside of the realm that I came to discover because it seemed self-contained. So I am describing what is this beautiful, lush greenery that Dan so aptly describes is his community. But I want you guys to feel this because it's a distinct part of New York. Dan, one thing I did not state, and I think it's important to the story, and then we're going to change gears. I did not state purposely why Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village were created in the first place. Take us back to World War II, where New York was in its history, and setting some controversy aside, what was the intent?
Yes, after World War I, New York City was experiencing a very severe housing shortage. And there were efforts to try to deal with that by adding supply. And people like Robert Moses saw opportunities to do a lot of it in a very short period of time by clearing out areas that he viewed as undesirable or urban blight, as he would refer to them. And he had been successful in a development in the Bronx, but he had his eye on doing something big in Manhattan. And with an effort to try to build a lot of units all at once, he worked with the state legislature. He got MetLife in his hooks and made them a deal that was very generous to them and also good for his ultimate goals to build this community. And it was an effort to try to not only deal with the low vacancy rate and the housing shortage that existed, but also you had all these veterans who were about to come home from the war who had to go somewhere. And as they were describing it, as like the community was approved by the contract you described, but before it was open, there were people who had, soldiers who had come back. They had just gotten married. They were living in their in-laws' homes. They were desperate to find an opportunity to find their own housing. There was a huge wait list for this community the moment that it opened, and that was a testament to how much and how badly it was needed. And there were ultimately, between Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, about 11,200 in the community, and home to 30,000 New Yorkers today.
Well, I think what I really felt, and it was a tidbit or a piece of trivia I didn't know of, that they were reproducing like rabbits. And so there was a nickname, and this was post World War II. The entire nation was growing in the suburbs. But here we were in New York, bringing a piece or a feeling of the suburbs to the urban community.
That's right. I mean, it was known as Rabbit Town, and there were baby carriages everywhere, and moms and dads everywhere. And it sort of had that, that feeling of a brand new community that had been designed just for them. Now, we would be remiss to not mention who that was and for whom it was exactly built, because MetLife excluded explicitly and unapologetically Black residents from the neighborhood when it was first opened.
Yep.
And that was a real black mark on this neighborhood and on this development. And it was a black eye for MetLife, because they were forced very, very quickly thereafter to reverse course and to actually admit Black residents as a result of lots of activism by the residents who lived in the community, who said, this is really unacceptable. They started inviting Black residents to come live with them as their house guests, which I just love that part of the story. There were efforts to try to evict the people who were the most active agitators for integration, and all these servicemen were lined up to protect their neighbors from being evicted. So it really has a complicated early history, but frankly, with a community of this size right in Manhattan, that history stayed complicated for a very long time. It wasn't as racially complicated thereafter, although it continued to be a predominantly white community for many, many years. It was always a place where you had a lot of tenant activism and a lot of interests out there to try to force social change and to defend the interests of their neighbors. But that was the very ugly early history of Stuytown, which definitely deserves to be mentioned as we present this idyllic, rabbit town of all these, moms with baby carriages. They were white moms with baby carriages, and the landlord, MetLife, was deliberately excluding Black residents when the place was open.
Well, I was particularly struck by one of the narratives that one of the early activists was a veteran himself in World War II. And he posed a question, whether it was on a bullhorn or he was just speaking to himself, because you quoted in the book, these Black soldiers saved my life along with a lot of other people, and they can't live with me? This is nuts. This makes no, it saved my life.
I thought he put that so beautifully. And it made the perfect argument, and the nonsensical nature of that discrimination. And he was a great leader of that movement, which, and they ultimately brought MetLife to terms and got them to reverse course. And the city council ultimately passed a law that prohibited discrimination in housing in contexts like this, which was one of the very first initiatives like that in the country. And this was years before, federal housing rights laws were passed, but it was passed in New York City. And as a result of the discrimination in Stuyvesant Town and the advocacy of these residents.
I want to get to one more point of advocacy and then switch gears to your advocacy. Can you explain, particularly, we have a lot of listeners that are not New Yorkers, and they may not understand the concept of rent control, rent stabilization. Can you explain what that is and how it fits into the context of this story?
Sure. In New York, there are some protections that are afforded to rents of certain units. And, if your apartment happens to fit certain criteria, you are in an apartment which is covered by the rent stabilization law. And what does that mean for you? It basically means your rent can't go up by very much from one year to the next. It means you can't be terminated. Your lease can't be terminated for no reason. You have a legal right to a lease renewal. And it affords you a lot of stability in your existence to know what to expect, to know what to predict. A governmental board called the Rent Guidelines Board approves every year the increases that a landlord may impose on residents in rent stabilized apartments. And what happened in Stuyvesant Town was after the contract between MetLife and the city had expired, the tenants pushed to get this community covered by rent stabilization, and it was covered by rent stabilization. So all of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, as of 1974, were covered by rent stabilization, which meant for these residents that their rents were stable, predictable, and allowed them to live comfortably, and in most cases, below the market value of what those apartments otherwise would have been.
Okay, and that is the key for our transition here. Because now we get to 2006. So for all of these years, this is a peaceful place where teachers and nurses and many other people that may not be investment bankers or in high income professions are living in a place of stability. 2006 comes along and an event occurs. And when I read this, Dan, to me, it was like the shot heard around the world followed by the Boston Tea Party. That's how I was thinking about it, because a revolution's about to ensue. But the question is why? And in this world of capitalism, where there are buyers and sellers, especially in New York, walk us through the event that occurred in 2006 that was the Spark Germ. I'm not exactly sure what the right metaphor is. I'll let you describe it.
Yeah, well, what happened was I was 6 or 7 months into my first term as the city councilman for the neighborhood. And I got a call from MetLife's lobbyist. And he said that he wanted to give me a heads up that MetLife was, exploring marketing the property, which I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I don't even know what that means. They're exploring it. They're exploring it. No biggie.
Oh, thanks for the heads up.
People explore things all the time. Like, what are the chances this actually happens? Selling Stuyvesant Town? Come on, that's like, I was like both confused and terrified at the same time. I didn't really know what to do. And it was when minutes later or hour or two later, however it was the same day, I saw the news went up on the wires that MetLife was in fact, entertaining the possibility of selling Stuytown. That was when I realized that lobbyists don't tend to call city council members like just in their exploratory phase.
Hey, how you doing?
They call them when it is done and it's the last box they need to check. But we were in a position of saying to ourselves, well, what do you do with that? If you are the local tenants association, which had been well organized for many years, fighting back on rent increases for this or that, all things that were technically allowed under the rent stabilization laws, but were subject to interpretation. They fought back, very, very aggressively on a lot of those. And your local councilman wondering, how do you navigate a situation where all of a sudden the homes for 30,000 people are going to go up for sale all at once? So if you're talking about a spark, that was the spark. The spark was really felt more as panic than anything, just to be completely honest, because I wasn't sure I knew what the right thing to do was. You had a few choices as I saw it at the time. You could sit back and watch the thing unfold. You could, call press conferences and, yell and scream about the need for affordable housing in New York City. Or you could try to find a way to shape the outcome and to try to do something that might actually bring this very complicated dynamic to a positive result. And that was what we decided to do. And I will say, and people who read the book will see that some of the best ideas that we association or me were not mine, but I had the sense to jump on some of them when they came forward. But we had a neighbor, a guy named John Crotty, who said to me, Dan, you know what? Here's the moment. Here's the moment. Look, you should put together a bid to try to buy Stuyvesant Town on behalf of the tenants. We can convert this place into home ownership. We can give people an opportunity to build some equity in their homes. We can deliver to MetLife what they're looking for, which is a sale price that would be respectable and something that would give them what they need to justify to their shareholders. And I thought at first when I heard this idea, I thought it was like bonkers, nuts. I mean, like, and I was talking to some of the other tenant leaders. I said, they would ask me, like, what are we going to do? Pass a hat, like door to door in the neighborhood and collect change? I was like, I don't know. But we ultimately got smart quick about how we could put together a bid on behalf of the tenants to compete in that auction that MetLife had now set up. And we announced that we were going to do that. The Tenants Association of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village was going to be a bidder in the auction, and that we were going to try to buy Stuyvesant Town on behalf of the tenants. So there was your spark to set it off, and there was your spark that got us to the starting gate.
Now for you, though, this is an interesting confluence of several of your life. The born bred, let's just say raised there. You were a government major at Dartmouth College. You were an attorney. You went to Penn, so you're a lawyer. You're a councilman. What are you in this? Are you resident, lawyer, councilman? How did you show up?
So that's a really good point, because I was wearing a few different hats at the same time. And I was even a little nervous about that, because here I was helping the Tenants Association lead a bid to try to buy the property, which as a resident could have served to allow me to buy my apartment. So there was potentially even a personal benefit to me as one of 30,000 people. I even went to the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board and I said, hey, before I do anything here, like, is this okay? Like, I'm a government official and I'm a resident and I'm acting with the tenants. And they said, you're not getting any special benefit beyond what any of the other 30,000 people are. You're totally fine. Right. But it was a line to walk. And I think that, the fact that I was both resident, tenant advocate, and councilman allowed for us to be taken even a little bit more seriously. Right. Because at the end of the day, it was really the Tenants Association that was advancing this. I mean, I was obviously in an important supportive role, but like, this was a Tenants Association initiative, but it was being supported and led by their local councilman. So it created a very powerful synergy between the interests of the tenants and the interests of local government about what we wanted to get done, and how we could argue for it in a very effective way.
Had you considered yourself at that time self-labeled as an activist? Is that what you know?
No. Actually, it's so interesting. I used to, I was a corporate lawyer. I mean, I worked at Paul Weiss and I did, commercial litigation for 4.5 years. And I ran for office trying to be a problem solver, the sort of person who people could come to when they needed to find a path to survive the complexities of local government. That's what I wanted to be. Activist was not in my, in my resume at that point. I used to joke, there was a councilwoman who represented the district further on the Lower East Side. Her name was Rosie Mendez, and she was like really passionate.
Activist.
She was great with like a megaphone. She could rile up a crowd. And I used to tease her that she needed to teach me how to like rally. And but over time, what happened was, there were a lot of things that were very dangerous for tenants that really actually did make us very angry and frustrated, and did call for, meaningful public advocacy and critique. And I felt like, it was a natural transformation as those sorts of things came to be. And of course, I always made an argument like a lawyer would, right? Even in my advocacy, it was not just throwing, bombs and just seeing where they landed. I always was making a case based on the law, based on a principle, based on what I thought was an alternative that was viable. Those were always really important things to me, which is one of the reasons why we opted for the route of actually presenting a bid to MetLife in the multiple billions of dollars for them to consider, because it wasn't just about saying, no, 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 we're advocating against something. We actually wanted to present something affirmative for MetLife to possibly embrace, which was that was novel for local tenants association and their councilman.
I want to explore a little bit of the backstory that got you there, because you did not go to law school and the typical go to college, go to law school, go to Paul Weiss. Describe what you did after college, because I sense there was a social consciousness that had to have been there already, that whether you knew it or not was likely pointing you to this moment. What happened after college? Where'd you go?
Well, I worked first for a civil rights organization in New York, where it was called the New York Civil Rights Coalition. And I directed a program in the public schools called the Unlearning Stereotypes, Civil Rights and Race Relations Program,
Right.
which was it was founded in the wake of a racially motivated murder in New York in 1989. And it was designed to get students in the public schools talking to each other across racial and ethnic lines, and to combat stereotyping of all forms. So I did that for a couple of years. Then before I went off to law school, I went and spent some time down south. I was in Virginia and Georgia helping to rebuild some African-American churches that had been burned by arson. There was a whole string of church burnings in the South in 1995, 1996. And I remember thinking to myself, well, first of all, this is hideous. And I felt a little powerless. But I also remember thinking that, you always read in the New York Times about people who flocked to a natural disaster from around the country, to people of goodwill who wanted to be supportive, and they just went there. And I would always be impressed by that. Like, who are the people who step up and volunteer and leave their lives behind to go help in a moment of national crisis? And I looked at myself and I was like, wait a minute, I'm about to go to law school. I have, I got a little time on my hand. That's going to be me. So I went actually to religious organizations in Manhattan. I asked them to sponsor me to go down south to help rebuild as it turned out, two of these churches. It was, it was a very meaningful experience for me. Much more, and by the way, in terms of what I added to the process, it was not my drywall or insulation. I feel
Throwing that
certain,
hammer on the.
I mean, I feel certain that I did not, cause any harm, but I was not there for my skills. But what I thought it did was, I thought it sent a very important message that people of this country will not stand by and be idle when these terrible acts of hate occur. I was very happy to be able to do that and to be present for the congregations of these churches and to help lend a hand. So yes, there was definitely a social consciousness there, and an interest in civil rights.
Why did you decide to become a lawyer?
I decided to be a lawyer because I thought that with those interests in civil rights, in public policy, in government, that law was a very appropriate avenue to find a way to affect change. Here we were directing a program, that Unlearning Stereotypes program, telling kids about how to affect social change through nonviolent means and to use the laws and rules that are available. To me, it was a natural fit. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to use my law degree for, but I did know that it was going to be something in the service of the public in one way or another. It felt like an obvious route for me with that inclination.
But there's a very big turn here, because I know a lot of lawyers. I'm friends with a lot. I've worked with lawyers my whole career, but I've not known any New York City councilmen. I got to imagine there's a whole lot of challenges that come with that. Why did you decide to run for city council?
Well, when I was a few years in my time at Paul Weiss as a litigator, I saw that there was going to be a vacancy for the city council district where I was born, where I grew up. That, of course, included Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, but also went all the way up to the Upper East Side, up to 98th Street. So it was a district, for your listeners who are familiar with Manhattan, from 14th to 98th Street. It included the United Nations. It included ultimately part of Times Square, Central Park South, Fifth Avenue. So it was a very big district in Manhattan. And I thought that that would be a very, very good way for me to use both my interests in service, the legal skills that I had picked up over time and certainly had learned at Paul Weiss and in law school, and to advocate for my neighbors and to find ways to improve my community where I had grown up. And I was fortunate that, I mean, I know it does not happen on the first go around for everybody, but I was fortunate to win in my election in 2005. And I came in January 1st of 2006, was my first day in the New York City Council.
And little did you know that the Boston Tea Party moment was going to occur, because there was a revolution. So let's get back to that. I don't want to give too much away here, Dan, because I loved your book. And I want people to read the book because it's such a riveting story. But we want to put a little bit more context on a more personal note. So tell me about you. People know that there was a lot of controversy and there was a big fight, and ultimately the title of your book gave a little bit of away how it is we came to fight what was and win the worst real estate deal in history. But what we do on this program is people come on just like you who have done something, a cause. What did you learn about human beings, if anything different than what you had learned before? And what did you learn about yourself through these twists and turns of this crisis?
So, as you might imagine, with a community of that size, there were a lot of different interests.
I cannot imagine the size and scale of those interests.
And there were a lot of ideas of what the right route should be. And nobody had really come out and said, for the purpose of this effort, we deputize the local tenants association and their brand new city councilman. Because nobody expected it to happen.
That's a good point to hit out there.
So it was really a default that, we were the only people who actually could have filled that role. But what I learned about my neighbors and about people generally as part of this was, there were a few different categories of people out there. Some who were real pragmatists. They appreciated the effort and the directional moves that we were making.
Right.
There were people who were pragmatists and had thoughts on alternative moves that we might make. And then there were people who were also a little destructive. There were people who wanted to push us off kilter at any turn.
And would have been very happy to see you flame out, burn out, go away, fail.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was a shocking part as I read this. It's like, oh my God, they want this thing to fail. Yeah. Make it fail. Oh my goodness.
That was interesting to me. Now listen, some of it coming from like a real policy difference.
Appreciate that.
I certainly understand.
Yep.
But there were, and we saw this particularly with the advent of not yet even social media quite yet, but like the existence of anonymous blogs, which were really present at the time and pre-Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, et cetera, where we couldn't discern what the voices were and who actually felt what. And it made it very easy to tear down or try to tear down an effort which was designed to try to protect people. So it was both, I learned that there is a fair amount of skepticism out there about anything that anybody tries to do that is affirmative in government.
I love the way you put that. And how did you navigate the weight of enormous expectations for those who were counting on you to make this succeed? Walk us through how you felt. I mean, every day, like, you got everybody's coming at you. Describe to our listeners what that felt like.
Well, it was, it was very difficult.
I bet.
It was very difficult to try to balance all of those conflicts and still push the ball forward,
Right.
because it was very easy to sort of like take the shot and want to crawl, into a hole and never emerge.
Right.
But the entire point of it was to advance something and to
Right.
advance something big. So I think on a personal level, for me, it was to have enough positive reinforcement around, and to know that there was enough rationale to do what I was doing, that it overcame the negative forces that existed out there. So for me, like just knowing that there were people who appreciated what we were doing,
Right.
who understood what we were doing, who shared frustration with, voices that were trying to, to me, that on a personal level, that helped a lot. It gave me some oxygen, and okay, you know what? We're on a path here. Like this, the whole world is not against us, even though sometimes it feels like it. There is there's a fair amount of support for what we're doing, and it was important to have that.
Yeah,
Uh,
I can only imagine, the protagonist to not lose encouragement in the story is either going to face tailwinds or headwinds, and one's going to be stronger than the other. So in your case, the encouragement that came from the forces around you that helped you climb that mountain in spite of the headwinds gave you fuel. If you were to look back at this, and we know the outcome, but the book states so much of how you got there, would you have done anything differently?
yes, I'm certain that I would do things differently. The biggest and most important was something that I did do differently. We had so many iterations in this story
Indeed.
and so many opportunities to correct course.
Right.
Was when the property went up for sale in the first instance, the tenants, we were outgunned. We were just like, we weren't ready. How could we have been, right? Like the sale of 11,200 homes was sprung on us, and it was actually, the transaction happened within 3 or 4 months total, which is like the speed of like buying a studio apartment. It was extraordinary. So we were not ready. But one of the things which I learned from that was that we were going to be ready. Like we were not going to have the same dynamic play out again, where somebody was going to spring an auction on the tenants of this community, and we were going to scratch our heads and wonder what to do. So
But
when Tishman Speyer and BlackRock defaulted, we knew we were going to have another chance.
Mhm.
And that was the moment where I said, okay, roll up sleeves. We take control of this process. We don't leave anything, for chance anymore. We are going to now figure this out, get some professionals on our team, and find a way to deliver a good outcome here.
well, the great maestro Leonard Bernstein said, in order to achieve anything great, you need two things: a plan and not enough time. And I suspect you were, as I was reading the book, is like, what are you fighting here? And you were fighting time. You were fighting so many special interests, people who looked at this project in the lens of their own self-interest, but also you didn't have all day, you didn't have all year, you didn't have all decade. You're proceeding this mountain with a lot of unknowns. That must have caused you to bob and weave and go home some days and say, I don't know if I've got the strength to do this.
Well, that's right. The complexity of time was one which, it wasn't all we had to meet a deadline or we were scrambling quickly to an outcome. In many cases, it was that the end date was so uncertain
Right.
that we had to find ways to continue to show momentum to our constituents and to continue to make progress even toward an indeterminate ending. And so, for people who, rightly in many cases are skeptical of government and they don't know what's happening, I felt like, if we don't make progress, we're just going to get run over here. We have to show how things are moving. And so that became an enormous pressure to, how do you educate 30,000 people all at once? You can't. How do you do it in pieces? How do you find people where they are? How do you talk to them and explain what you're trying to do in a way that is credible, that reaches them, and that makes sense? And so we were constantly fighting up against that challenge of talking to tens of thousands of people and try to explain what was or was not happening and why. That was a real challenge.
Indeed. We're getting close to the finish line here, but I want to communicate to our listeners and to our viewers, first, the name of the book. And it's called Saving Stuyvesant Town: How One Community Defeated the Worst Real Estate Deal in History. And the author is here with us, and his name is Dan Garodnick. And it tells such a compelling story. And it's about the human condition and about people's needs and people's wants. And it was wonderfully written from one author to another, Dan. I commend you for it was a lot of clarity to it in spite of the enormity of players. There were a lot of people, a lot of cooks in this kitchen.
Thank you. Yes, there were. Oh, it was busy. That's why you do a character list at the front.
Yeah, that was good. That was very smart. In fact,
we got it.
I appreciated that. And as I went through this, I found myself, as I was reading, I was just going back to the top, like, who is he? And then got it. But beautifully done. Let's leave our listeners with a few things. First, where do they find you? Where do they find the book? And when will it be available to the public?
Great. Well, thank you for that. DanGarodnick.com. So you can see the spelling of my name on the screen if you're watching. Otherwise, it's DanGarodnick.
And you can hold up the book if you would.
I certainly can do that.
Good. That way they can see it too. They see it on my back. Great.
There it is.
There it is.
Saving
Beautiful.
Down.
Love the picture too.
It was. Thank you. So you can actually find me, and you can find the path to the book on that site. You can get it at Amazon. You can get it at Cornell University Press. But if you go to dangarodnick.com, all the links are there, and I hope you will. And I think I appreciate the intro and the way you've described it, because I do think it is a story of human condition and adversity and challenge, as much as it is about government, politics, or real estate. And I think so I appreciate that.
Well, the story that I read, Dan, I read the story of you. I read the story of Dan Garodnick, and that's what I related to, because it was such a wonderful narrative of what you went through and the cause, the risks that you took. You could have been doing better things on any given night than everybody throwing fire at you because nobody was happy about it or whatever the situation was. And to all of us out there who have city councilmen like you, thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it a lot. And listen, it was an honor to be in that role. It was a great privilege, but yes, I appreciate that you acknowledge the difficulty of it all.
Oh, I'm glad as long as you were doing that, it allowed me to do what I want to do. And I thank you for that. So now 2 more things. When you go to your LinkedIn, we see Riverside Conservancy. Tell us about what it is you are doing when we see your public face today.
Today, I'm the president and CEO of Riverside Park Conservancy, which is a not-for-profit that supports 6 miles of parkland on the west side of Manhattan.
Right.
So, I like to hug the rivers on either side.
You're a New Yorker.
It's a great public-private partnership and allows me to continue to be a public servant in a slightly different way. I find it very, very satisfying to raise funds for and then deliver in this 6-mile public space. Allows me to scratch many of those same itches, to be able to find positive outcomes and to deliver a good result, but in a slightly different way.
And let's leave one last thing to our listeners. If you could give them one piece of advice as it relates to this book of the human spirit and your transformation, what would it be?
I would say that it is okay to set a very long-term goal and to see it and to focus on it and to know that it's not going to be a straight line to get there. I can say that was the case in Stuyvesant Town. And frankly, it was even the same with writing the book. I mean, just to, on an even more basic level, which is, you just see where you want to go, but know that you might not end up right there. You might end up there a little bit in one direction or the other, and assess and to know that it's very rarely going to be a straight line to be able to achieve that ultimate goal.
That is beautiful advice. In fact, climbing that mountain as Dan climbed this mountain was never a straight line to the top. It's a series of twists, turns, and continual adjustments. Dan Garodnick, what a pleasure it was to have you on A Climb to the Top. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.
It was my pleasure. And to our listeners, you know where to find me. I'm Chuck Garcia. You can find me at chuckgarcia.com. Always love hearing from you. Please let us know if there's any other guest you have in mind. I'd love an introduction. But thank you as always for tuning in, and good night.